About 700 feet inside a granite mountain outside Salt Lake City, there is a vault behind doors that weigh 14 tons. It was cut into the rock of Little Cottonwood Canyon in the middle of the 1960s. It was built to survive a nuclear blast. The temperature and humidity inside are held steady year-round, and it holds roughly 2.5 million rolls of microfilm. Birth records, marriage records, parish registers and death certificates from more than 100 countries. Millions and millions of ordinary people who died long before anybody thought to film the paperwork. Now, if I stopped there and rolled some ominous music, you would have a perfectly good conspiracy video. A secretive American church, an armored bunker in a mountain, and the names of the dead. So let's do the opposite of that. This is what the temple actually does, and why it is the single most misunderstood building in this country. Which means doing something a little awkward. I have to explain a building that millions of people hold sacred to an audience that has largely been told it is sinister. And there are parts of this that genuinely do look bad. I am not going to skip those. Skipping them is how you lose a thoughtful person in the first 10 minutes. One thing before we go inside. If you have ever driven past one of these and wondered what on earth happens in there, you are the exact reason this channel exists. A like or a subscribe is what keeps something this size running. That is the whole pitch. Let's go in. Almost everything you have heard about that building is about the fact that you cannot go in. Almost none of it is about what happens inside, which is the part I can actually explain in plain words. The suspicion gets its full hearing too, and it is not a weak case. A Masonic lodge, a ceremony that has been edited more than once, and a real scandal involving the names of Holocaust victims. There is also one line I will not cross tonight, and the reason for it is not the one you would guess. Start with the confusion, because it is bigger than people realize. When someone says they went to a Mormon church on Sunday, they did not go to a temple. Latter-day Saints have two completely different kinds of building, and they get merged into one in the public imagination constantly. The ordinary one is a meetinghouse, a chapel with a steeple, a gym behind it more often than not, folding chairs, a library with the good pens, and a car park. There are tens of thousands of them, and Sunday services in every one of them are open to anybody who walks through the door. No ticket, no interview, no membership check. If you want to see a Latter-day Saint worship service this Sunday, you can. Nobody will stop you, and somebody will almost certainly try to feed you. The temple is a different building for a different job, and there are far fewer of them. The count has been climbing fast, past 200 in operation, with well over 100 more announced or under construction. And it changes at nearly every general conference, so if you want the number today, the church's own newsroom keeps a running list. Temples are not where Sunday services happen. Nobody preaches a sermon in one. There is no congregation, no choir, no collection. So when a headline says the church is secretive because outsiders cannot enter its temples, understand what is actually being described. It is not that the front door of the religion is locked. The front door is wide open every Sunday of the year in tens of thousands of buildings. It is one specific room in one specific kind of building, used for one specific purpose, that has a threshold on it. And here is the fact that makes the secrecy framing hardest to sustain, and almost nobody outside the church knows it. Every single temple before it is dedicated is opened to the public. For weeks, anyone can book a ticket for free and walk the whole building. The sealing rooms, the baptistry, the instruction rooms, the celestial room. Journalists go. Local clergy of other faiths are usually invited first, ahead of the general public. When the temple in Rome opened in 2019, the open house drew crowds through the winter, and the church made a point of hosting other religious leaders in it. When the Washington, D.C. temple, the one you can see from the Beltway, reopened after a long renovation in 2022, hundreds of thousands of people walked through it over about 6 weeks. Then it is dedicated, and after that day the doors close to the public. That is a genuinely strange sequence, if you assume concealment is the motive, and it is the single best argument I have. If you were hiding something, the last thing you would do is invite the press and every pastor in town to tour the room before you started using it. What actually changes on dedication day is not the architecture. It is the status of the room. Which brings us to what happens in there. 4 things, and I'm going to name all 4 plainly. The first is baptism for the dead, and it is the reason for the vault in the mountain. In the basement of every temple there is a font, and it rests on the backs of 12 carved oxen, which is a direct copy of the molten sea described in the first book of Kings in Solomon's temple, resting on 12 oxen facing outward. In that font, living people are baptized on behalf of specific dead people, by name, one at a time. The scriptural hook is a single verse that most Christians have read past their whole lives. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 29, where Paul, in the middle of arguing for the resurrection, asks what people are doing being baptized for the dead if the dead are not raised at all. Paul does not explain it. He mentions it in passing as something his readers already knew about, and then moves on. Biblical scholars of every persuasion have written about that verse for centuries, and there is no consensus about what practice he was referring to. Latter-day Saints read it as evidence that the early church did something like this. You are free to think that reading is wrong. What you cannot say is that it was invented out of thin air. Now, why does it matter enough to build a bunker in a mountain? Because of the problem underneath it, which is one of the oldest and most painful problems in all of Christianity. If baptism is required, what about the billions of people who lived and died without ever hearing about it? Every Christian tradition has to answer that. Some say they are lost. Some say God makes an exception. Some invented limbo and then quietly retired it. The Latter-day Saint answer is unusual, and it is this. The dead are still there, still themselves, still capable of accepting or refusing, and the physical ordinance can be performed for them here by someone living, and then it is entirely up to them. Nobody is made a Mormon by this. That is the misunderstanding I most want to fix tonight. The theology is explicit that the offer can be refused, and the church's own materials say so directly. It is closer to leaving a letter on a table than to a conversion. That belief is why the church started microfilming the world's parish registers in the 1930s, why it cut a vault into a mountain to keep them, and why it now runs Family Search, which is free, which is the largest genealogical archive on Earth, and which is used every single day by enormous numbers of people who have no interest whatsoever in this religion. If you have ever built a family tree online, there is a decent chance a Latter-day Saint volunteer somewhere transcribed the record you found. The old prophecy they hang it on is the last 2 verses of Malachi, the last 2 verses of the Old Testament, about turning the heart of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers. Read that line, then look at the mountain full of microfilm, and whatever you conclude about the theology, the consistency is remarkable. The second thing that happens is called the initiatory, a short ordinance of washing and anointing that echoes the consecration of priests in Exodus. It is brief, and it is one of the parts members find hardest to talk about with outsiders. Because described flatly, it sounds odd, and described properly, it takes an hour. The third is the endowment, and this is the main event, and the thing people are actually curious about. The word just means a gift. It is a ceremony of instruction, presented as a kind of dramatic narrative running from the creation through the fall and toward a return to God's presence. And along the way, the person makes 5 covenants. And I can tell you what those 5 are, because the church publishes them on its own website. Obedience, sacrifice, the gospel of Jesus Christ, chastity, and consecration, which means committing your time, talents, and means to building up the kingdom. That is not a leak. Go and look it up. The fourth is sealing. A marriage performed in a temple is not performed until death parts you. It is performed for time and for all eternity, and children can be sealed to parents in the same way, so that the family unit is the thing that persists. The scriptural hook is Matthew 16, verse 19, where Christ tells Peter that whatsoever he binds on earth will be bound in heaven. For most Latter-day Saints, that ordinance is the emotional center of the entire religion. When a member talks about the temple with tears in their eyes, 9 times out of 10 it is this, and specifically, it is a dead parent or a dead child. So that is the building, a font for the dead, an anointing, a covenant ceremony, and a marriage room. Now let me put you inside it, because the picture in most people's heads is wrong in a way that is almost funny. You come in a normal door into a normal foyer with a desk. Someone checks the recommend, the way a librarian checks a card. Then everybody changes clothes, and this is the part I would put in front of anybody who thinks this religion is about hierarchy. Because inside that building, every single person is dressed in white. The same white. The bishop, the woman who cleans the building, the surgeon, the 19-year-old, the man who owns the car dealership on the corner. There are no vestments. There is no collar, no robe of office, nothing that marks out a rank. In a room full of people, you cannot tell who presides over anything. There is no money in there either. Nobody takes a collection in a temple. Nobody is paid to work in one. The people who guide you through it, hand you the clothing, read the names, run the font, are volunteers, and a very large share of them are retired couples who signed up for a shift, sometimes at 6 in the morning, several days a week, for years. If you have ever wondered what the workforce of that building looks like, It is largely grandmothers, and the work is done a single name at a time, not in bulk. A person is immersed in that font for one dead person, by name, then the next, then the next. Saturday mornings in most temples belong to teenagers doing exactly that. 12 and 13-year-olds in white, standing in a line in a basement, reading names off a screen of people who died in the 1700s. It is one of the strangest and most ordinary things in this religion, and it is going on somewhere in the world right now while you watch this. That is also worth knowing because of how long this pattern goes back, and it goes back further than Utah. The first temple this movement ever built went up in Kirtland, Ohio, and was dedicated on the 27th of March, 1836, by people who did not have money to build a barn. The story that has always been told about it is that the women broke up their china and their glassware to mix into the stucco so that the outside walls would catch the light. Then they lost it, along with the town, in the collapse we covered in Part 3. They built another in Nauvoo and abandoned that one too, and it burned. And then they built the one everyone recognizes. Ground was broken for the Salt Lake Temple in February of 1853, and it was dedicated in April of 1893. 40 years. The walls are around 9 feet thick at the base, and the granite came out of Little Cottonwood Canyon, hauled down by ox team, several days a block, until they finally got a rail line in, which is the same canyon I opened this video in. The mountain they cut the vault into is the mountain the temple came out of, and there is no symbolism intended by that. It just happens to be where the good rock is, but I like it anyway. One more because it closes a loop from Part 5. In 2024, the church bought the Kirtland Temple back, along with several historic buildings in Nauvoo and a collection of manuscripts from the Community of Christ, for a reported $192.5 million. Which means the two branches of this family that split apart in a grove in 1844, over who Joseph Smith meant to lead them, ended up doing a property transaction about the first building he ever built. History does not usually give you an ending that neat. I've watched people try to explain all this to a friend in a kitchen and get it wrong every time. So why do the doors close? And who decides? To enter a dedicated temple, a member needs what is called a recommend. Getting one means 2 interviews, one with a bishop who is the unpaid volunteer leader of a local congregation, and one with a stake president who oversees a group of them. The questions asked in those interviews used to circulate as rumor. Then in 2019, the church simply published them in full in its own magazine and on its own site. You can read every question right now. They are not what people expect. They are about belief in God and in Christ, about honesty, about how you treat your family, about keeping the commitments you have already made, about whether you affiliate with groups working against the church, and about the health code. There is no test, no essay, no fee, no wealth requirement. And the framing of the whole thing is worth noticing, because members are asked whether they consider themselves worthy, which is a very different question from a committee ruling on it. Here is the honest way to think about the threshold. It is not that unworthy eyes cannot see the room. It is that the room is where people make binding promises, and the church's position is that a space for promise-making belongs to the people making promises. You can disagree with that, but it is a coherent position, and it is not unique to this faith. But before I defend that threshold, I have to tell you where it cuts. Because there is one place it cuts badly, and pretending otherwise would make everything else I say tonight worth less. Picture a mother who is not a member of this church. Her daughter is getting married in a temple, and on the morning of the wedding, that mother sits in a waiting room or on a bench outside on the grounds, while her child makes the largest promise of her life in a room the mother is not allowed to enter. Then everybody comes out and takes photographs on the lawn, and the mother smiles for them. That happens. It has happened tens of thousands of times. And if you are inside this faith, and you have never let yourself sit with that image for a full minute, do it now. Because that is the actual human cost of the threshold. And it is paid almost entirely by people who did nothing wrong. I raise it because the church itself finally did. For decades in the United States, there was a rule that if a couple married civilly first, so that everyone could attend, they had to wait a year before being sealed in the temple, which meant the choice was posed as a straight trade: your mother or the sealing. In May of 2019, the church removed that waiting period worldwide. A couple can now be married civilly in front of every person who loves them, and then be sealed the same day or the next. That change got a fraction of the coverage the controversies get, and I think it is one of the most quietly decent things the institution has done in my lifetime. It also amounts to an admission that the previous arrangement had been asking families to pay too much. Nobody phrased it that way, but that is what it was. Which is the right moment to give the suspicion its strongest version, because I promised I would, and it deserves better than a straw man. It goes like this in 4 parts. 1. Sacred, not secret, is a slogan, and slogans are what people reach for when the plain word is uncomfortable. There are specific things in that ceremony that participants covenant not to reveal. That is, definitionally, a secret. Calling it something warmer does not change the category. 2. The origin. Joseph Smith was initiated into Freemasonry in a lodge in Nauvoo in March of 1842. 7 weeks later, on the 4th of May, in the upstairs room of his store, he introduced the endowment to 9 men, and the form of that ceremony has clear structural resemblances to Masonic ritual. Signs, tokens, a progression through stages, an oath of non-disclosure. 7 weeks. That is not a coincidence a fair person can wave away. And the critic's version is blunt. He joined a fraternity, liked the machinery, and repackaged it as ancient revelation. 3. It has been edited. If this is a restoration of an ancient ordinance, why does it keep changing? In 1990, the church removed a set of graphic penalty gestures that had been part of the ceremony. In 2019, it made further changes, including to the covenants women make, so that women now covenant directly with God rather than through their husbands. The presentation has moved from live acting to film and back in places, been shortened, and been rewritten. Ancient and unchanging things do not usually get revised by committee. 4. The Holocaust. Starting decades ago, members submitted the names of people they had no relation to for proxy baptism, including large numbers of Jewish victims of the Holocaust. In 1995, the Church signed an agreement with Jewish organizations to stop it and remove the names. It kept happening. Anne Frank, the parents of Simon Wiesenthal, members of Elie Wiesel's family. The Church apologized repeatedly, restricted database access, disciplined submitters, and it still leaked out. For a family whose relatives were murdered for being Jewish, having those names posthumously entered into someone else's Christian ordinance is not a technicality. It is an insult that lands exactly where it hurts. That is the case. All 4 parts of it are real, and the 4th one in particular is not a misunderstanding to be corrected. It is a wrong that was actually done. So here is my answer, and it is 4 answers, and none of them is a bow on top. On the word secret, I will concede the point rather than argue it. There are elements of that ceremony participants promise not to disclose, and that is a secret in the ordinary sense of the word. What I will not concede is the inference. The question is never whether something is undisclosed. It is what the undisclosed thing is doing. Grand juries are secret. Adoption records are sealed. Confession is sealed. The nuclear codes are secret. Your friend's therapy session is secret. We do not treat undisclosure as evidence of wrongdoing in any of those cases, because we can see what the confidentiality is protecting. The reason the temple gets treated differently is not logic, it is unfamiliarity. And I would rather say that plainly than keep polishing a slogan. On the Masonry. This one I am not going to squirm on either, because the Church itself no longer does. Its own historians write about the Nauvoo Lodge openly, and the Joseph Smith papers document the whole sequence, dates and all. The faithful explanation is that Joseph Smith taught that ritual forms can be preserved, corrupted, and restored, and that recognizing a form is not the same as inventing the content. The critical explanation is that he borrowed. And I will tell you honestly that the resemblance is not the kind of thing you can explain away with a paragraph, and that anyone who tells you the similarities are superficial has not looked. Where I land is that the form and the content are genuinely different questions. The Masonic ritual is about the building of Solomon's temple as an allegory of moral character. The endowment is about the creation, the fall, and a covenant path back to God, ending in a marriage that outlives death. Same grammar, different sentence. You can decide how much that satisfies you, but you should decide it knowing both halves. On the changes. I actually think this is the strongest of the 4 objections, and the answer that gets given most often is the weakest, so let me not give it. The honest answer is that this church has never claimed the presentation is fixed. It claims the covenants are. And the covenants have in fact been remarkably stable while the wrapper around them has moved, sometimes a lot. Latter-day Saints believe in continuing revelation, which is a doctrine with a price attached. And the price is exactly this. If you believe God still speaks, you cannot also insist nothing ever changes. Some members find that thrilling, and some find it deeply destabilizing. and both reactions are honest. What is not honest is a church claiming both permanence and revision at once. And to its credit, in 2019, the leadership announced the changes rather than letting people discover them in the room, which is a change in itself. On the Holocaust names, there is no defense, and I am not going to attempt one. The theology says the offer can be refused, so from the inside, no harm is intended. But intention is not the whole of an injury, and the people harmed had told the church exactly how it landed, and it kept happening. What the church did afterward was real. Agreements, apologies, restrictions on the database, a policy that members submit only their own ancestors. That is the right correction, and it was made too slowly. Both of those sentences are true. Now the line I won't cross. And the reason isn't the one you'd guess. I am not going to walk you through that ceremony. Not because you cannot find it. You can find the full text online in about 4 seconds, published by people who filmed it with hidden cameras, and versions of it have been printed by opponents of this church since the 1840s. Concealment is not on the table, and it has not been for a very long time. I won't do it because a transcript of a ceremony is the least useful way to understand a ceremony. You can read every word of a Catholic ordination, or a Jewish burial, or an initiation in any tradition on earth, and come away knowing precisely nothing about what it does to the person going through it. Ritual is not information. And because a lot of people watching this hold that room as the most sacred thing in their lives, and I can explain what it is for in full without turning it into content. That is a choice about what kind of channel this is, and you are entitled to disagree with it. And that gets me to the actual villain tonight, which was never a critic and was never a hidden camera. It is an assumption. Secret equals sinister. The reflex that says the only reason to keep anything out of public view is that it would not survive being seen. That reflex is very modern, and it is very local. Almost every human culture that has ever existed has kept thresholds around the things it holds most sacred, and nobody thinks that is proof of a crime. In Herod's temple in Jerusalem, there was a low stone barrier separating the outer court from the inner, with inscriptions in Greek and Latin, warning that no foreigner could pass it. 2 of those stones have been found by archaeologists. One of them sits in a museum in Istanbul, and you can go and look at it. In Solomon's temple, the innermost room was entered by one man, 1 day a year. Nobody reads the book of Leviticus and concludes there was a scandal in the Holy of Holies. And you already live this way. There is a reason the delivery room is not a spectator sport, and a reason people close the door when a parent is dying, and a reason a wedding vow is said to one person and not published. Not one of those is a cover-up. They are all the same instinct, which is that a few things in a life are diminished by being watched. So what does the temple actually do? Here is the whole answer in one sentence, and I have taken a while to get to it on purpose. It is the building where Latter-day Saints try to fix death. That is it. That is the whole thing. Every one of the 4 ordinances is aimed at the same problem. The font is for the ones who died without the chance. The endowment is a covenant meant to outlast a lifetime. The sealing room exists so a marriage does not end at a graveside, and a child who died at 4 is still yours. And the mountain full of microfilm is there because you cannot do any of it without a name, and most of the human beings who have ever lived are on their way to having no name left anywhere. You are perfectly free to think the whole framework is wrong. Millions of thoughtful people do. But if you walk away from this thinking the closed doors are about concealment, you have got the building exactly backwards. It is the least cynical thing this church builds. It is a granite bet that the dead are recoverable and that families are not temporary, made by people who are willing to spend enormous amounts of money and volunteer time on strangers who died 200 years ago in a village they will never see. Whatever else that is, it is not a scheme. Schemes pay better. So here is my question, and I do read these. What did you think the temple was before you understood it? And what changed your mind? If you are a member, I want the honest version of what you assumed as a teenager, not the version you would say in a lesson. If you are not, I want to know where the picture in your head came from, because I suspect most of it traces back to about 3 sources, and I would genuinely like to know whether I am right. And if you arrived certain, and you are leaving certain, say that too, and say why. I ask because that comment section is going to do something this video cannot. Somebody is going to send this to a friend who thinks that building is a compound, and what that friend reads underneath it will land harder than anything I said in it. I'm Nathan Reeves. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.